All right, let's look at chain stitch. So this is the design that is for chain stitch. It's quite simple, just a simple lines up a tree with chain stitch. I'm actually going to start down here on the brown. So you can see where my needle is, and that is just a little bit different. So from the other designs which start in the all wholly within the tree itself, if you want to start it here, that's okay, go right ahead. Now I'm starting it, might just go a little bit higher so we're not entirely within, we're almost within the seam allowance here. All right, chain stitch, you need to start. So my needle is threaded, I have a knot. We might actually put this in the, excuse my hand, in the spring tension frame just to hold it steady. Now you can see I've still got a gap in this frame. I'm just holding the fabric firmly or taut, but we're not torturing it, put it that way. All right, with chain stitch, you need to, again, it's easier if you create a bit of a rhythm. So we're going to create the loop with our thread, come back to the hole that we started in, and take a small stitch forward. You can do that and then do what I just did then and wrap the thread around the needle, push it all the way through, and then pull that through to create the chain. Pull it over to one side. Now this stitch, you need to start inside the loop. Create another stitch. The thread goes around it and then pull the stitch through. So I'm sort of working away from myself. Needle goes into the chain, the loop from previous stitch comes all the way through, that thread goes around it and pull. I'm just going to untangle that, grab the needle, and you can see the loop is forming. So the frame helps us not to pull this too tightly. If you like, you can turn your work so that you're stitching in a slightly more natural fashion. Create the loop and pull it. So I'm sort of pulling I stitch right-handed, so I'm pulling my right hand across my body to complete that stitch. If you lay that down, you can then stitch into the next one, wrap the thread under the needle, long enough to create a bit of a tangle there. Use your needle if you can to undo any of those. It just gives you a finer point. So the other option I often do is create a part of a loop and hold it in place with my thumb. Then I needle into the previous loop, create the stitch and pull it through. So the length of that stitch you take determines how long your chain is going to be. So you want to keep that firm the other way, otherwise it's going to come undone. So I'm going up the main stem, create my loop, take my stitch and pull. Let me draw a couple as close as I can into the previous loop. Make your stitch. Make sure those threads go under your needle, and then looks like a bit of a tangle, but then it will pull the chain taut. Now I'm just going to park my needle and reposition the frame. sure my threads are not caught in the tension hoop. All right, let's see if we can make a mess out, make sense out of the mess of threads. All right, looking much better. All right, so you can see there I've created a bit of a loop with my thumb. I'm going to slide the spring part of the hoop away from this position because it's in the way. All right, are we focusing? In through the previous hoop, over the top of the threads, and then pull it through. Create the loop, take the stitch. So this has a gentle curve in it, this design. You can see that my thread is getting a little bit tangled. If I let that hang, it will actually untangle a little bit, and that will make things a bit easier. Get rid of the black thread. All right. Start the stitch inside the previous loop, take a stitch over the top and pull through. So yes, you can do a gentle curve. It's a little bit harder with corners. You need to secure them in the corners. Just untangling my thread again. So when we get to the top of this, make sure I'm in field. Almost there. To secure it, we're simply going to stitch. I've got one more stitch to do. So that was my last chain stitch. So to secure that final chain, you simply put your needle down right next to the outside of the chain, so that you've got a tiny holding stitch right at the very top. So what I'm going to do now is come back with another bit of thread and do this one and then this one. This is not one that I would travel so much, so I would be tying off at each point. So same with all the other stitches, make a small loop, needle under, and then secure the knot. You can weave that tail through a couple of stitches and then trim it off. Okay, creating another knot. All right, so this one here, I'm going to bring my thread up, not inside, but beside. So you start right beside where you came up and create the stitch over the loop, pull it tight. Inside the loop, and then stitch down to hold that final stitch. Now I'm going to knot it at the back as I did the other one. Oh. So there you have chain stitch. You can see the variation in the threads. You'll notice that I think these are not as neat as the ones that I did in using the spring tension hoop. I've started here because this is in the seam allowance. So once this is sewn together, the stitches will start right at the base of the trunk. All right, next stitch is fly stitch. Fly stitch can look a little bit like a Y, and it's done in 3 steps. So this is the marked design for fly stitch. So we're going to start at the top and work our way down, and then we're going to add in the branches. So I'm just going to put this into the frame, and then we'll be ready to stitch. So I find it easier to hold the tree this way to work the stitch. We are going to be working right to left, but I find it easier to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to come up a little bit up and away from the edge of our mark. So this line will be our stem, but to actually do the fly part of the stitch, we need to come up slightly upwards and away. Now I'm just sort of tucking that under my thumb to create a bit of a loop. And then we're going to go down here. So I'm actually the same distance or the same angle up from the stem, but I'm going to come out at that top part of the stem over the top of the thread. And then I'm going to pull it down over the top, and you can see it creates a bit of a Y shape. And then we're going to take a stitch into the stem. Oh, and that completes the first stitch. So from here, we're going to do the same thing. You can come up. I'm going to come up about there. So I'm pulling it forward. About the same distance on the other side. And you need to come up right in the same hole. Right, just grabbing my needle again properly. In the same hole that you went down into to create the stem. And then we're going to go further down on the stem. My thread has become tangled. Just going to get that, sorry, off camera here for a sec. All right. So once you're comfortable making the stitch, what you could do is, instead of going all the way to the back, making sure I'm in the hole there, and then, so always make sure the thread that you're pulling through is on top of the loop. If you don't want to go through to the back, you could take a stitch into the stem and then immediately come back up over to the right or to the left on this one to create that next Y part. And that is fly stitch. I think I get a neater result by just pulling through to the back. Now if you like a, sorry, I'm getting it tangled a bit on the fabric. If you like a thinner stitch or a shorter stitch, then those are ways that you can vary the detail of the stitch. by that. I will put some examples. I have stitched a couple of variations, so I will put those in the photos just after this video. Now I'm not going to stitch this side because I have a branch coming in, so I'm actually just going to do half a stitch, which is a little bit, my thread keeps tangling on the fabric at the moment. Back on camera. So it's a little bit, so I'm basically doing a half a stitch and finishing the stem. So I'm basically just doing a couple of straight stitches to make it look like I've done part of the stitch, and we'll go back to doing the fly stitch. So I'm trying to actually see so that I can stitch it as well as keep you in field of view, which I'm not always doing, my apologies, and I've just managed to pull my needle off. So okay. Oh, where's that needle gone? There it is. Okay. So simply up one side, hold it down with your thumb to create the loop, half a loop, go to the other side to create the fly. It's like a leafy design. Make sure your thread goes over the top and then stitch down into the stem. And I can't find the needle. Oh my goodness. There we go. Oh, you can see I went a little bit crooked. That's what happens if you don't come up in the middle of that hole right on the stem line. But in the grand scheme of things, it will be okay. So one variation you can do with fly stitch is that I've made my stitches in between a little bit longer than I might that I did in the previous example. I wouldn't go too much longer than this because it does create a bit of a catch hazard on a project. So if you are doing this on a project that is going to be used, then you may find that things can get caught in these longer stitches. But that's one way to vary. So my fly part is quite shallow and smaller, and this stitch is quite long. And you can see on this example that, say, this stitch is quite much a deeper Y than some of the others. So that's also another way that you can vary the stitch, is by having the Y shape closer to your stem line rather than out wide like this one. So just a couple of ways you can vary the look of your embroidery. This is what the back of fly stitch looks like. So you've got the two bits of the fly, and then there's the gap before it comes down to this, where the needle is, would be where the straight part is on the stem. This is where we did that extra couple of stitches because we had the other one. I finished the main bit and I finished off with a knot ready to start the side branches. So this is the design for backstitch and French knots. So I'll go ahead and get that in the frame. I have my needle threaded with a knot in the end, and we are ready to stitch. So with backstitch, we are stitching from left to right, but we are working from right to left. It sounds a bit odd, but I will show you. So you need to come up one stitch length in from the edge of where you want your first stitch to be. Pull your thread all the way to the front, and now we're going to take a stitch backwards, but then going to come up on our design line about the same stitch length ahead, and that is our first stitch done. Sorry, off camera. Going to go back down into this same hole and come up. So our stitch is forming from left to right, but we are working our way. I'm just going to move this handle around out of my way a little bit, and hopefully that will mean I can keep it on screen better for you. Alright, so with anything that involves a line, the shorter your stitch, the smoother your curve will be. So if you've got curves like this one, you may need to take shorter stitches, not really long ones. And it's right here that I'm going to do a French knot. So I'm just going to zoom in because I need to put it down on the table to do this. So around, just want the 2 threads, and wrap it round the needle twice, and we're going to put it into the hole, or beside the hole where the thread came up. Now this thread here I'm actually holding a little bit taut so that it can't go anywhere, and you're pulling the rest of your thread through the knot. I will do another one in a little bit to show you. Just park the needle and go back to normal viewing. And then we will come down here to be able to continue our backstitch to complete that part of the design. So we're going to stitch up underneath the French knot, take a stitch, pull the thread through, so it's going back and then forward, hence the name backstitch. So when you get to the edge, just take your thread through to the back, and there you have the first rung or garland, I guess, around the tree with a French knot at the center. So I'm going to tie off at the back so that I can start back down over here. Alright, on to the next row down. So we'll just go to the first bit and show you the French knot again. I don't want my stitches too big, otherwise my curved shape will not be smooth. Into that same hole. Up to the top of that point. Alright, I'll leave the camera out a bit so you can actually see both my hands a bit more clearly. Now I am right-handed. I apologize for those who are left-handed. So holding the needle, I'm going to wrap the thread twice around the needle, pull my needle back. I've still got hold of those thread wraps, and I'm taking a very slight stitch over a couple of threads, again still holding this one firmly, pushing the needle down through. You might find you just need to give it a little bit of a tug to get it through the wraps and the fabric. If you've wrapped it too tight, that will be
a bit harder, then slowly pull all the way through. Hopefully that will focus. There you go, and there is the French knot. This is what the back of the backstitch and French knot design looks like.